Back at it with the Kaufman Corner podcast. The good doctor, Dr. Rany, Jazayerli, Soren, Petro with you. As we're proudly brought to you by our friends at Gann Asphalt and Concrete, proudly serving the greater Kansas City area. Free consultations, no commissions, in-house crews. Every project comes with a written warranty. Parking lot problems are no more. If you know Gann, call 816-484-3338. It is our big baseball draft. The MLB draft is right around the corner. It's time for us to break it down. We do it right now on the Kaufman Corner.
You're listening to Kaufman Corner, the most in-depth analysis of the Kansas City Royals, breaking down the Royals like no one else can. Kaufman Corner is hosted by Rany Jazayerli and Soren Petro. Rany is a co-founder of Baseball Prospectus, author of Rany on the Royals, and former columnist for Grantland, The Ringer, and The Athletic. Soren is the award-winning afternoon drive host of the program on Sports Radio 810 WHB in Kansas City. Kaufman Corner is proudly brought to you by Gann Asphalt and Concrete, Kansas City's nationally recognized full-service paving and pavement maintenance contractor, making parking lot problems disappear since 1994. Free consultations, no commissions, in-house crews, and every project comes with a written warranty. Find them online at GannAsphalt.com or call 816-484-3338. Gann Asphalt and Concrete. One contractor, all things parking lot. Gann Asphalt and Concrete is now hiring for all positions: project manager, dump truck drivers, operators, and crew members. Starting pay up to $30 per hour based on experience, with paid time off and insurance, just to name a few of the benefits. Check out GannAsphalt.com for more info. Now, here's your hosts, Rany Jazayerli and Soren Petro.
And welcome, Rany Jazayerli, Soren Petro with you as we get ready to talk about the Kansas City Royals draft, where the farm system is. And Rany, I don't know about you, where else would you turn but to the Bible of baseball, Baseball America, if you're going to do that. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I've been a subscriber for only about 32 years now, so just a short period of time. But Baseball America, when it comes to covering the minor leagues and even the major leagues, is, I mean, I say this as somebody who founded Baseball Prospectus a few years into that run. I've always kept my Baseball America close by me, whether when it was in newspaper form and now when it's online. And very excited to bring on our next guest, JJ Cooper, who's been with Baseball America now for how long now, JJ? 20 years?
Coming up, it'll be 21 in September. I am an old man now, and I accept that.
I think that goes for all three of us.
Yeah, I don't know if you see the gray hair, if you see the lack of hair. We're all in it together on this podcast. JJ, thanks for joining us. We're big fans. Rany said it, of all the work you guys do, and you've given me such a wealth of knowledge of the baseball drafts and the minor leagues over the years. It's great to get a chance to talk to you here on the podcast. And let's start with this. Just how good is this draft overall? What are we dealing with when you got a club like the Royals that needs so many things?
This is a special draft. I say that like it's funny. Like usually when you talk to scouts, front office officials, and all, they understandably, I feel like that they often see the negatives in a draft more than the positives. Like I'm usually more bullish on a draft than the people we talk to in the industry. I remember back on the Adley Rutschman, Bobby Witt Jr. draft, thinking like that, that Adley by himself makes a draft a truly special draft because you had this clear 1-1. And I know we are in a world post draft, the 2012 on draft process where you have bonus pools and how much you can lower, how much you spend on your number one pick means you have more to spend later and all that. And so it's not the same world that we were in back in the Strasburg and Harper days where the Nationals could pretty much say, yeah, we're going to take Steven Strasburg. I mean, we're not idiots. We're going to take Strasburg. Or yes, we're going to take Bryce Harper. We don't need to be coy about this. Now there's a reason to be coy because you're trying to play players off of each other and get all that. But that draft, I felt like I was more bullish than what we were hearing from the industry. This one, everyone feels like is bullish about. And that's partly because you do have two players at the very top, maybe three, who check all the boxes to be a number one pick. But it's more also beyond that you have a top 5 that feels like a really good top 5, but then you have the depth of it. I'll put it this way. We're prepping, we have our 2024 list out, but we really aim for the draft finishes. And the next day we're like, okay, turn the page onto the 2024 draft. Whoever's number 1 on the 2024 draft, and again, admittedly, they have a year to go forward. Paul Skeens, we really liked at this time, but we weren't going to say Paul Skeens was the number 1 pick at this time last year. But whoever's number 1, high school class or college class on our 2024 list, you probably wouldn't put 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th on this list. That's how good this list is right now. And again, we'll see what 2024 does in 2024. But that's the difference between this class and next class. There is no clear number 1 next year. This year, if I want to make the case for Dylan Cruz or Paul Skeens or, Wyatt Langford or Max Clark or Walker Jenkins, you have these guys who you could make that case for a number of these guys. Next year, you don't have that.
Of course, Andy, getting that music to our ears.
Yeah, isn't that lovely? In the year the Royals are drafting 8th because they missed out on the lottery pick is the greatest draft ever. And next year they might be that right now they're at the 2nd worst record, so they'll probably be drafting at the top, and we have no idea who the number 1 pick will be. That makes me feel good. But given that, JJ, because obviously it is a new world now with the lottery pick selections. The Royals drafting 8th in a draft where it does seem like there's a very clear top 5. You mentioned those 5 names,
yes,
and everyone seems to think that's the top 5. And then that 6 to 24 range is, there's no consensus at all. Do you get the impression from the Royals' standpoint that where there is a mess, there is also an opportunity in the sense that because you can play your draft pools around, that you can save money early on. The Royals did this a couple years ago with Frank Mazzucato, and really one of the big surprise picks in that draft. But they did have a plan and they did execute it, and they got Ben Caderna later and Carter Jensen, and Luca Tresh even in the 17th round. Do you feel like this is the perfect opportunity for the Royals to work out a deal with maybe not necessarily the number 1 guy on their board at the 8th pick, but the guy who will sign for the right amount of money, and that there's enough depth in this draft that they can then convert that money saved into a really good 2nd pick, 3rd pick, etc.?
Potentially. The thing I would say with that is, and again, this is where this gets really tricky is it's like, okay, so who's on the board when they pick, right? Because there is a thought on my part that if you have someone who you think is clearly better than everyone else on your board, don't get too cute with it, right? Like sometimes you can get too cute and you can let a better talent go by. And then you turn around and you go, okay, yeah, we got some nice, we spread our risk, but in doing so, we got some players who are likely more role players than stars. But that said, like, yeah, you picking where they're not picking 6. Like if I'm sitting at 6, there feels like there is this consensus top 5, but I put an asterisk on that, which is we also have Chase Dollander came into the year, Tennessee right-hander, as a guy who was considered a candidate to go 1-1, and he had a much more up and down 2023 season than he did in 2022. But I could absolutely see a team who, if they have identified, I haven't identified this, we haven't identified this, but if they're like, oh, this is what's wrong with Dollander, and this is how we'll get him back to what he was last year. Okay, well, then the 5 becomes 6. Someone could say Rhett Lauder, who we just saw duel with Paul Skeens, Wake Forest ace, and who just had a season that was, if not for Paul Skeens, would have been like, okay, this is clearly the best pitcher in college baseball this year, the most consistent, the most successful, all that. Pitching at a very difficult park where Wake Forest hit a bazillion home runs, they do every year. Didn't matter for him. He was just out there going consistently, outing out for outing, who's really pretty well optimized, pretty well where you could say, take this guy, and I feel like we have more guys now. We've gone away from this. We used to have the Mike Leakes of the world, where Mike Leake went from Arizona State to the rotation without a minute in the minors. We had guys do that. And it's crazy to me now. I get it. Like Paul Skeens, as good as he is, should be shut down after the CWS, after the draft. I get that because he's worked a lot. He's worked really hard this year, and his season started in January. But in a world now where we have the Wake Forest pitching lab, which is the envy of many major league teams, is there really, like, I'm not saying you don't have to get adjusted to the 5-man rotation, a different baseball and all that, but is there really that much to be gained by some of these guys of going to the minors? And okay, I'm sorry, I'm really tangentially answering questions, but like, I look at what the Angels did with Zach Neto, and they benefited from that. They turned around and said, they sent him straight to AA from Campbell, which is not exactly LSU or Wake Forest, but a very good college program. And then they turned around this year in late April, and said, we've got David Fletcher. This guy's better than him. Let's just put him in the majors. And it's really helped them. I do think that there's a chance, even at 8, maybe it doesn't help the Royals right now that much, but I do think that there is a chance that there could be someone there, a Rhett Lauder, a Chase Dollander, where you're like, this guy could move very quickly to the big leagues for us. Or to go back to actually answering your question, you could be sitting there at 8 and you're like, we have 12 guys on our board who we think are all pretty similar talent-wise. And in that case, absolutely, okay, if you think that the guy who's, 12th on your overall board is willing to take $1.5 million less than the guy who's 8th on your board, and that allows you to spread the money, well then, okay, you mentioned the Mazzucato one, and I'll go back. There was also the Hunter Dozier and Sean Manaea draft where they did that, where Manaea, I believe, if I remember correctly, got more money than Dozier did, even though Dozier went, top 10. You can, I guess that's probably the example where it's definitely worked for them, in that Manaea ended up having a useful big league career. It was for someone else, but it was because obviously flags fly forever, and the Royals did use that to make a key trade during their World Series run.
JJ, let me ask you this before we go any deeper on these players. What's wrong with the Royals drafting approach? Like as you look at it, I know that the draft is an inexact science, but when you get it seemingly wrong as often as they've gotten it wrong, there's clearly a flaw in your methods and mechanisms. And they came in, and I had JJ Piccolo on last week, or a couple of weeks ago now, on my radio show, and he said, I said, look, is there more to be done in the minor leagues? I said, and he said, yeah, we really had to spend our offseason restructuring the major league level. And I get it. They had a lot of interviews, a lot of time. And I pointed out that NFL GMs, often their first draft is their worst draft. And I think it's because they're scrambling around doing other things. Like I'm sure there's some, paralysis by analysis on all major sports drafting, but there is also a process to it. And if you can't get to it, you have problems. Do they have something that you look at it and say, this is why they seem to miss? Or do they take the right people in your estimation, and their development is the issue? Do you have a theory on where they need to make adjustments?
So if we're looking at the top of the draft, it's hard to find an example of a year. The Mazzucato year is one where they took a guy high in the draft who was higher than consensus. But as Rany pointed out, there was a plan to that. It wasn't like, oh, we're taking him here and we're going to, because we just think that he's better than all these other players, and we're just going to zig where everyone else zags. It was part of a spread the money around type approach. Asa Lacy has not worked out. I mean, that's pretty clear. So far, you cannot say that Asa Lacy, but picking Asa Lacy where they did wasn't something where, when they took Asa Lacy, that you said, what are they doing? I liked Asa Lacy. I wish I could explain to you, like, I've watched in the offseason every one of Asa Lacy's last, 7-8 outings that he had last year. And there's all the talk of injuries. There was also it was beyond injuries. It was a guy who lost the feel for it was the thing, whatever you want to call it. It was one of those situations where he was throwing pitches and you could tell that it was complete loss of feel for, I don't know where this pitch is going to go. And I can't tell you that happens sometimes. And I'm not smart enough to say, oh, clearly that's because the Royals screw up their pitching development. I can't point to that. I can't tell you why Daniel Bard was someone when he was a Red Sox who battled this and then managed to come back, and where other guys haven't been able to come back and all that. Like, I don't have an answer on that. But I do look at it. Most of the guys that the Royals have taken at the top of the draft have generally been kind of consensus guys. But I do think if you said, like, so what's the problem? Again, Bobby Witt at 2, I know that his on base percentage is lower than we wanted to, if you're a Royals fan, but that still makes some sense to me. Like, okay, the choices were Bobby Witt Jr. or CJ Abrams, and I would rather have Bobby Witt Jr. today. Mm-hmm. And I still think that if you look at it long term, that is a great cornerstone guy to build around. But if I look at the big picture, which ties into with the draft, also ties into why has this rebuild not taken hold? It all goes back to that college pitching draft and the fact I can't say that they took the wrong guys, because those were, again, generally relatively consensus guys. I thought that they got a steal getting Singer where they did. There were concerns about Singer, but at the same time, this was a guy who was one of, if not the best pitcher in college baseball that year, who took the best team in college baseball, to a title. These were not guys who you're like, well, they took a wild card here. Brady Singer, Daniel Lynch had as much up momentum, going into that draft. Yes, he wasn't a guy who had the same lengthy track record, but he was a lefty who everyone who saw him at the ACC tournament said maybe this guy was the best guy at the ACC tournament. You had guys like that. You had Jackson Kowar. It was like, well, this fastball changeup combo should work without a whole lot of extra work to get that guy to the big leagues. And the problem is here we are, it's 2023, which, yes, you give time for drafts to take place, but we are now at the point where you have to say, Dave, Lynch has had some good starts this year, but that's kind of all that they're getting out of that group in 2023. And I think that does go back to pitching development in some ways, in that, okay, the Royals did a rather, I would say, relatively notable and famous now revamp of the hitting instruction. And, after the season where MJ Melendez and Nick Prado and all really struggled in Wilmington, and it kind of helped turn those guys around. But I feel like that, when you say, like, okay, well, what happened? Well, those pitchers have not developed the way they needed them to. And that doesn't mean every one of them, but you needed one or two of those guys to develop into at least number 2/number 3 starters. They haven't gotten that. And that ties into, okay, big picture, what are you going to do as an organization to make sure that the next wave, if you bring in a Chase Dollander, if you bring in a Rhett Lauder, what are you going to do to make sure that pitcher then goes on to have the success that the last wave has struggled to have?
Well, on that note, one of the reasons why this season has been so frustrating, it's not just the major league level. I mean, I had a meltdown on the show a couple of weeks ago, and honestly, it was really more about the minor league performance this year than the major league performance. I mean, the major league team is on pace to lose, over 110 games, but you can put up with that in a rebuilding team when a rebuilding team has a top 10 or at least top half farm system. The Royals do not have a top 100 prospect, right? Asa Lacy, number 4 pick in draft, not top 100. Frank Mazzucato, not top 100. Promising, but not top 100. And then Gavin Cross, Baseball America officially took him off there. He started the year as a top 100 prospect, no longer a top 100 prospect. That's another one of those picks where he seemed to go around the consensus, with the 9th pick. It didn't seem like a huge reach. I wasn't the guy I would have picked, but he has had some real struggles this year. And so the question is, the Royals, they did fire Dayton Moore last year. They fired the manager. They fired the pitching coach. But aside from Dayton Moore, no one else in that front office, notably no one involved with the scouting and the draft, was let go. Have you gotten any sense that the Royals are doing anything differently this year at the minor league level, that they are kind of, or even that they're aware of the depth of the problem, that whatever they've been doing, you mentioned the hitting development being revamped, and what's been so frustrating for us is that worked, and yet the Royals have been so slow to take the lesson learned from that and say, we need to revamp our pitching development, we need to revamp our drafting in general. But have you gotten the sense in the industry that the Royals may be owning up to their problems and changing things at all?
I haven't gotten a giant sense of, they're in a complete revamp. Although the minute you start bringing in, and you've talked about this, I know on the show, the minute you start bringing in Rays people, right, which they have, you are revamping in some ways your pitching approach, because, and I think that they've done very well with this over the years, the Rays, I feel like that what the Rays, which is another organization I've done top 30s for a number of years, and it doesn't, not everything works even for them, but what the Rays have done really well is identify players who fit with what they do well. So to give Shane McClanahan as an example, like, I do believe that if Shane McClanahan was drafted by 10, 15 other teams, he would not be the Shane McClanahan he is now. There was a lot of reliever risk. There was a lot of control questions coming out of college for him. It was a big arm, and it was, let's see if you can develop it. And what the Rays do really well is, I mean, they simplified it for him. There's the strike zone. Your stuff's good enough. They'll keep making mechanical tweaks. They'll keep working with you, all that. But it was just trust your stuff, throw it over the plate. And that starts building on itself the same way that if you're saying dot the corner and you can't, it works counterintuitively for you. You are being told you have to do this, you can't do it, then it makes you feel more frustrated that you can't do what you're being asked to do. I feel like that big picture on all of this, there's another part of this. Like, I was thinking a lot, knowing that we're coming on the show. Okay, we've had a couple of rebuilds that in the AL Central, I would say that right now you would say the Royals rebuild and the Tigers rebuilds did not take. I think that that's fair to say at this point. And whereas, like, I look at the NL Central, and I would say that if you're a Reds fan right now, you're probably wandering around in a haze of joy that's like, I can't believe it. This team is both good and fun. And that's in a year where Nick Lodolo hasn't basically pitched this year, and Hunter Green's on the IL right now. And if you said, what is the Reds rotation right now? It's like, it's spare part plus staff arm plus, okay, we'll shrug our shoulders today. And they're still just finished a 12-game winning streak, which is an example of, okay, well, why do some of these take and why some of these not? And I go back to, like, but part of that is for the Reds. Okay, you get a bolt of the blue, you sign Ellie De La Cruz for $65,000 and he turns into the best prospect in baseball. Well, kudos to you. You get credit for that, but that's something that's hard to replicate over and over and over. But the other part I come back to is like, the Reds they did acquire a Luis Castillo, and he turned into an ace. And then because of where they were able to then turn Luis Castillo into pieces. They were able to turn, they made a big trade with the Twins. They had pieces to where when they were selling, they had valuable players to trade. Tyler Mahle, name escape, but like they got multiple players back for Tyler Mahle. Right now, if you said, who is the player, because the Royals have not been good. No, they have not been a contender for a number of years. And I'll kind of throw it to you guys. Who's the big ticket trade item that they traded? And you're like, well, they got some players back for that over the last 3-4 years.
There isn't.
I can't come up with it.
They traded Whit Merrifield 2 or 3 years too late. That's probably the closest that you can come. Right. So, yeah, no, that's absolutely.
And so that means the farm system's thin because they don't have those guys. Like, what I would say is a healthy rebuilding. And I know that they were trying to be, but a healthy rebuilding team when you say, how are they coming to where they are? How's their farm system? The problem for the Royals is that this was a farm system that's, to go back in Royals history, it should be where it was in like 2014-15, where you're like, okay, yeah, it's a little thinner now. We just graduated Prado and Pasquantino and Witt and, Massey and Millen, we can go down the list and to go with the pitchers. But the problem is the guys they've graduated, none of them have turned into stars yet. And they haven't also, like the draft, they haven't acquired, even with top 10 picks, any stars. And then, but they also haven't added anyone. The Orioles, for example, when they were moving towards it last year, but they still turned Jorge Lopez into Yiner Cano and Cade Povich, which those guys would be among, Cade Povich would be among the best pitching prospects in the Royals system. And Yiner Cano would be probably closing games or at least pitching the 8th if they were able to do that with the Royals.
Yeah, and that is, we talked about that. When they went into their rebuild, they had Danny Duffy, Salvador Perez, and Whit Merrifield that didn't, they all, you can even point to, I know it culminated in a World Series and flags fly forever. So nobody wants to take that away, but they were always set to have this mass exodus. And they did nothing along the way to kind of set it till the very end when they traded away Wade Davis for Jorge Soler. And you can see that they pretty much went like this with Jorge Soler, so they didn't even end up valuing him when it's all said and done. But they had 3 guys that they could have dealt, and they didn't deal any of them. I get it. We're watching the Reds have, Joey Votto still there. The Astros kept Jose Altuve. Maybe Salvador Perez fits that mold. There's no way that Duffy, Whit Merrifield, and Salvador Perez could be that guy you build around. And so Duffy, they got nothing. They got next to nothing for Whit Merrifield. And now they have 10-5 rights they've handed to Salvador Perez while they play their catcher in right field. So there's much on that front that leaves us scratching our head as to what the plan was. What would your plan be with this draft, JJ? If you sat with that 8th pick and you were the Royals, what do you think of? You mentioned the players that are there. Is there a dream scenario of who you think could make it to the Royals? Is there a dream manipulation you would try to do? What would you do if you were in the Royal seat?
So, okay. Well, one, if any of those top 5 somehow fall to 8, let's just say you take them and you say, woohoo, and you just you take the draft, after that. Okay. Let's assume that doesn't happen.
Okay.
If that doesn't happen, I start with kind of looking at it and saying, and I'm okay. So let's start with, let's play front office here. And I presuppose by saying, you asked me the question. I do not suppose that I actually have the ability to do this, but we'll do it as a thought exercise. Okay. So as a front office, are we as a front office, this mythical front office, willing to sell that we're starting over effectively? And what I'm asking with that is because if so, it does change the draft to some extent, as opposed to if I'm a front office and you say, no, the direction from above is, we know that this year is not going to be the year, but next year has to be a strong step towards 80 wins, 80, maybe the Central's terrible for a while longer and 85 can steal you something. If I have to be looking at a shorter time frame for job security, that's the ownership mandate, I'm looking at it differently than if you say, look, we have a relatively new ownership group, all that, we're willing to accept the last rebuild didn't work. And so we're tearing this thing down to the studs again. Imagine it's 2006. Imagine it's 2007. That's a different approach than if you say, no, we have to treat this like this is 2011, 2012. And by the way, we're also going to spend a little bit of money in free agency to patch holes and things like that. Okay, so I'm putting it to you guys first. Which approach do you think you all who follow the Royals
if
more
it's
closely
me
than
and
I do.
Soren, we're going down to the studs. We're
Yes.
starting from scratch. So let's just say we're not worrying about contending in 2024 or 2025. I always say no team out there is more than 3 years away from at least dreaming, if everything goes well, of contention. But there's no short-term goals here. This is all about the long term.
Okay. So if that's the case, then I do look at it and say, you know what? I'm going to go with one of the better college bats who's available. Is it a Kyle Teal? Is it a Jacob Gonzalez? Even though I'm not even sure what position Jacob Gonzalez. He's a shortstop in college, but I don't know if he's going to stay there. I shouldn't say he's not going to stay there. I don't know if he's going to stay anywhere close to there in pro ball. But you go like that, or I take a Dollander or a Lauder, partly because look, Noble Meyer, I think, is who we mocked, who's the best high school pitcher in the class. We mocked him to the Royals in our most recent mock. I'm not taking a high school pitcher right now because right now, I mean, that's one of those where we just know high school pitchers are riskier. High school pitchers, and one of the reasons I think they're riskier is high school pitchers are the players who have not gone through the pitching injury nexus yet, right? Like if you say, why am I so enamored with like a Paul Skeens, and people are saying, well, he's throwing 120 pitches, a lot. That's a heavy workload. I'm like, well, yes, but 21-year-olds doing that who don't show a degradation or show that they have to be shut down.
Right.
That's also, it's like they're demonstrating a survivor bias of sorts, right? That doesn't mean that they'll never get hurt, but it does mean something where you have the examples. If you're a Royals fan, you remember Ash Russell, and it's like you can take a high school pitcher and they can literally, in some cases, the Angels took a guy a few years ago, and it's like, wow, that guy was a premium pick, and his pro career finished with under 100 pro innings. Like that can happen with a high school guy. That basically never happens with a college guy. So I'm taking a college guy, either a bat or an arm. And if Dollander or Skeens, I mean, not Skeens, if Dollander or Lauder's there at pick 8, I'm really considering that, even if they may be ready a little too soon for this rebuild to the studs, that's fine, because those are the guys who also, if they step into your rotation, you might get more for them. Like, let's say that let's say that Zach Greinke, who was basically toiling alone on some teams there for a couple of years for the Royals, you can get a mint for guys like that. And I'm going to try to hit on the pick. And that's where I do think, like, I know that there's a value of spreading the money, but if I'm picking top 10, the key part of it is I want to hit on the pick personally. And if I do that, the rest of the draft will take care of itself. And that's where I'm going to go. I'm going to go for a Dollander. I'm going to go for a Lauder. I'm going to go for a Kyle Teal, a guy like that, rather than the best, high school bat or the best high school arm.
So that's interesting, because when we explained to you, or thinking long term, I thought immediately, okay, you're going to go with the high upside high school guy, and you went the college route. But basically, it almost sounds like your argument is take the college guy, even though he may be ready sooner, because he's safer, and then if he pans out, immediately you can flip him when he's still young, maybe even still as a prospect, or early in his major league career, and so you are still pushing out the value of that player to when you're ready to contend. It's a great strategy. It's a strategy we rarely see teams use. Certainly, we rarely see teams already thinking in the draft a guy with the intention of trading him if he pans out. But where the Royals are in their rebuilding process, that actually does make a lot of sense.
And again, like, also having a guy become a star is great. Even, even if you're not good, right. Like okay, then maybe that's also the guy that you extend. And maybe, again, it's not something where, maybe you just say, okay, this guy's peak is going to be 5 years down the road, and he's going to be expensive at that point, but we don't have anyone else who's going to be expensive, so we're going to keep him. But the other part of this is like, I do feel like, and I say this as someone who loves the draft, and the draft is incredibly important, all this, But I do feel like fans think that the draft in general is safer than it is from the standpoint of like, let's take the 2022 draft, right? And if we look at the 2022 draft, and like you brought up that Gavin Cross wasn't our 100, but he's not now. And I do have concerns with how his season has gone at high A, right? But I will also note with that, if you look at the top 10 picks, okay, Jackson Holiday went 1 last year. I would say confidently right now, even with some struggles in June, if you did it over again, Jackson Holiday would go 1 again. Drew Jones went 2. We haven't even basically seen Drew Jones play. He's had a shoulder injury last year. He's barely played this year. When he did not play very well, but let's give him a complete and total mulligan and say, okay, who knows? Kumar Rocker is not going to pitch again. He pitched in high A a little bit, which was his second, he's now multiple years removed from Vanderbilt. And he's now basically looking at Tommy John return in 2020, late 24 probably, and we see where he is there. Tamar Johnson's in low A. He has a slow start. He started to hit. Elijah Green is striking out at 40+% of his plate appearances. Jacob Berry has been statistically one of the worst hitters in Class A this year, which is concerning because he's a bat first guy who did not have a whole lot of defensive positions. Cade Horton's been fine, although he's also again an A ball, and they've been limited. They're stretching him out. Well, again, I would say that the Cubs may do that again. Brooks Lee has been fine, although I would say if you're the Twins right now and you go, we took the college shortstop who's a good bat, you would take Zach Neto, who went 13th, who's been a better bat and is a better shortstop. So, okay. And then we're to Gavin Cross. We just talked about Gabriel Hughes is giving up a lot of homers and sitting 91, 92 for the Rockies, which I know velo's not everything, but you do not want that out of a top 10 pick. My point just being, I'm saying take the college guy because this is a really good college class. And I'm saying take the college guy because even with the college guys, and I wrote about this recently, there's a nagging fear in the back of my brain. We just came off of the craziest offensive year in NCAA history.
Yeah, you
and so that's where the Louders.
I wasn't aware this is the most home runs ever hit in a collegiate season. Like I remember the late 90s. I found that mind blowing. So is there a sense that the whatever is causing that home run spike in college ball, whether it's the ball, the seams, whatever, is that making it almost more difficult though for evaluators to figure out which of these players are for real and which of these hitters are just hitting home runs because the ball is so juiced?
Well, but the thing about it is there's concern that not just the ball is, everyone thinks the ball is playing hotter, but I basically went about this trying to write this or not write this all year, where when I would talk to players, when our staff, not just me, players, coaches, other officials around college baseball, and I would say, I'm hearing that there's also tampered bats in college baseball. Dissuade me. Tell me that I'm crazy. Tell me I shouldn't write that. I don't want to be sensational. I'm not trying to. And over I got, oh no, we do bat testing, but the bat testing is so lax. Like you could drive a truck through these loopholes. And the key difference being, we always, again, if you're a professional baseball fan, we think of tamper bats. You think of Albert Bell and going through the ceiling and all that. If you cork a bat, I mean, that is like almost nothing as far as actually making the bat perform a whole lot better. Wood is wood, and there's very little you can do to make a wood bat perform differently. When you talk about an alloy or a composite bat, we're not talking about the same thing. Like if you go back almost 15 years now, like 08, 09, all of a sudden, the last years of the Beezer era, where they basically tested a bat at the factory, or right fresh out of the wrapper, and that meant that it was a legal bat. Well, some of those bats teams discovered that if you basically the more you use them, the more they turned into They turned into basically a trampoline. It was like, like that launched the ball over the and you'd have teams using one bat. The whole team, they would just hand the same thing because it's like, we've got super nuke bat here. We're just going to keep using that. It's not that now, but it is something where there's absolutely concerns that you are seeing players who produce exit velos, produce power that seems, surprising. And much like the steroid era, it's hard to know what's real and what's not. And so that's a concern here, is that there may be players who you draft because they hit 25 homers this year in a year where we had a bazillion players hit. Like, that was the thing. Like, yeah, we were 1.13 home runs per game this year. 1998, the last year peak drop 5, which is where you could have a bat that was 33 inches and 28 ounces, which was like basically handing Excalibur to any college hitter. That was 1.08 home runs per game. So we were more this year. There is concerns, and I've talked to teams about this who are trying to figure out, how do we discern, is this real or is this Memorex, to go, because I'm old, like I said, and I'll use an analogy from the 80s. How do we know that they're really doing this? Or are we going to give this guy a wood bat and then it's like, well, where did the power go? And so there's that concern too. And so that's where I keep bringing up like the Dollanders and especially the Rhett Louders, in that if you could pitch this year in college baseball, I know you can pitch, because this was imagine that you're pitching in, this is paid. Basically what Skeens did this year is the college version of Pedro Martinez in like 98, 99, where it's like everyone's hitting homers on every pitch, but Pedro's like, I'll just go out there and shut everyone down. That's where I'm kind of a little bit more on the college pitching this year than that. I'm sorry, I'm being wordy, but
no,
this is all
great stuff. It's great stuff.
That's very illuminated. Like, I'm like,
sure,
basically making the point that, generally, yes, we always value the hitter over the pitcher, but that this may be the rare year where, because of the added risk of the bats, that pitchers might actually have a better risk profile than hitters for the first time in a while. I guess I'm suffering from just, the trauma of repeated Royals blown draft picks. Like when you mention Noble Meyer, high school right-hander, I think of Ash Russell and Nolan Watson and, a dozen other guys. I'm like, stay away. When I think of Rhett Lauder, I'm thinking of the 2018 draft at Asa Lacy. I'm like, stay away. When you mentioned a college hitter, I'm thinking of Gavin Cross. That's why on the show I've brought up Arjun Nimala a couple of times, and the only reason is because the 17-year-old high school hitter is the only thing the Royals haven't tried, and I think it's the only type of draft profile that I don't have a negative experience with.
Well, on that, because I'm glad you brought it up, because I was going to bring it up. I've been leaving it out there because I know Arjun Nimala is a pet project of Rany's, and I thought he'd bring it up. But last year's guy like him was Cam Collier, and he's had struggles. Like, is that affecting Nimala's draft status, because Collier hasn't been the hit, because he was the 17-year-old darling last year?
See, and this is where I do think that age is part of the picture, but only part of it. And I don't, and again, I know Rany, you were, important in, the draft studies on this. I want to give, homage to that. But at the same time, I think you would also say, like, age is a part of it, right? We are obviously sitting in a world where, like, if age was everything, then, like, to take the extreme example, you had the year that Brett Beatty and Keone Kavako were first round picks. And Brett Beatty was 19 and was basically as old as a high school player could be. And Keone Kavako was 17 and was like, you know what? Even if Kavako takes an extra year, he'll still be younger than, but the difference is I remember, like, the first time I got to see Brett Beatty when he was a rising junior, and it's like, this dude really can hit. And, Bobby Witt Jr. was obviously there are older guys.
He's definitely the counter example.
Right. So with Collier, okay, he was really young, right? At the same time, he was also, to some extent, that meant, and again, this is not a knock on him, it's smart that he did this, but it was artificially constructed almost to make his youth even more valuable, which is he was young because he did the Bryce Harper. And so he sped up his clock and he went to a JUCO rather than being part of this draft class, because he would be he reclassified. He would have been part of this draft class. And then he would have been of normal age for his class as a high school player. And then you may have said, okay, that body at 18, am I, where do I want to take him? He still probably wouldn't have first round pick, but it would have been a little bit more of like, okay, where's the body headed? Is the athleticism going away? Things like that. Where by going to a junior college and performing, no, not performing at a Bryce Harper level, but performing, I think he really, again, we know that a lot of teams use models. I think it was really astute that he kind of gamed the model in some way, which is if your model takes age as a key factor, well, he sped his model, his year, his age up and made it like, hey, okay, well, we don't have a whole lot of examples of 17-year-old JUCO players. We basically have really one. And that guy ended up, how many more did he get? Oh, he got all the war. So, okay. Well, so as opposed to, again, when we talk about the high school players, we do have much more of a database, right? We have 17-year-olds who you look at it and say, wow, they were advanced for their age. And then the development just kept going. And then you have 19-year-olds who you could say derailed. And then you could flip it and say you have 17-year-olds who maybe we got too enamored with the age because when you look at it, they had less track record. And then you have 19-year-olds who are like, maybe we focus too much on the age because a lot of this comes down to like, it's funny. Like I always say something that's always been core to my minor league prospect belief is, as a general rule, teams tell you what they think about a prospect in subtle ways, which are ways like, well, where do they send him? Right. So I remember exactly where I was. I was at USA Baseball's training complex. I want to say it was back when they did the 40 top high school players, or maybe it was the NHSI. It must have been NHSI because it would have been right at the end of March, early April. I remember where I was when I heard that Bubba Starling wasn't breaking camp with the low A team to start that year. And I remember thinking at that moment, it was core to me. Like, doesn't mean he has no chance, but it does tell me right now, this guy's not as good a prospect as I thought he was. And I mean that from the standpoint of like the great ones basically almost without fail never are not ready for that first full season. And I say that Torrey Hunter can raise his hand and say, I'm the counterexample. And I say this, I mean this for first round picks, right? If you say so-and-so, Gerard Dyson, great Royal,
right,
needed some time. If you take a guy in the 49th round and that happens, all bets are off. If you take a cricket player and you try to turn him into a pitcher and it takes 7 years, or a knuckleball or whatever, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about if you take a first round pick and then the next year you send him out and you go, this guy's not ready for low A. That's a really, really frightening sign, especially for a hitter. And that's why with Mazzucato, he's having a very good year.
Yes.
I'm not ready to go say repeating a level is not the same as doing that the next step up the ladder. Doesn't mean kill him as a prospect by any means either, but it does means like the fact that you can go back to a level and face guys who are less experienced than you is not the same as going up to the Midwest League and doing the same thing.
By the way, thank you, because I got so much grief when I said, listen, they're throwing Mazzucato like under the bleachers. Like this is like, no, he's in complex league. And I'd hear, and even some of the media people that had talked to the Royals and were getting the Royals, spin on it. But he basically went a year after being drafted before he got in a place where he pitched where somebody could write down what he was doing and we could get some numbers and stats on it. And to your point, he was a signability pick, right? And so if it takes a little longer, that was kind of the plan. But I am so happy to hear you say, yeah, that's not a sign of future stardom when they don't get them going, right?
I will
If
say,
you really go, you play.
at least with Mazzucati, he was 17. Bubba was almost 19. He was
Yeah.
really old. And I remember, I don't remember exactly where I was, JJ, but believe me, when we came out the following year and Bubba Starling was not on a full season team and he was turning 20 in August, I didn't know how the next 10 years would go, but I could have drawn a blueprint. It wouldn't have looked much different than how it turned out.
The flip side of that is again, to use a positive example, like, hey, I will raise my hand. I missed it on Salvador Perez. We were, I was covering the Royals, big blue wave, we had the cover, all that. And I will forever. We only did one a year back then. And I had Salvador Perez as the number, I think, 18 prospect in the Royals system.
Yes, he was.
Which
nothing against you, JJ. I remember looking at the list, and I'm looking. I have the big blue wave on my wall here, the cover of that amazing Royals farm system. And I mean, it was a testament to how deep it was. But I remember looking at that list, and the one guy I was just like, this guy seems way too low. Was Salvador Perez? But it was about his age. He was like 19 still, and it was just like he was young enough to still be anything, and it turns out he was.
And the thing I would say though is again, teams show you what they think. Whereas Bubba at 19 was like, we've got to protect him essentially because he's going to get carved up. What the Royals did with Salvador Perez was like, there is not a test out here there's not a level that's going to. It's funny. I'm bringing this back to the Reds for a minute, but like, I always thought, like, I've written a lot about Elly De La Cruz this year because I find Elly De La Cruz fascinating.
It's fun.
If you don't, I don't know how you. If you love baseball, I am incredibly fortunate to get to do this. I love doing this. And I love the fact that there's always a new player like Elly De La Cruz coming along. But the thing that I just struck me does Elly De La Cruz have flaws? Absolutely. He chases too much. He strikes out too much, whatever. But the problem he has, and I still don't know the answer to this. It's like, if you hear people, especially in the prospect space, who speak with utter certainty, that's a concern to me because, again, I've been doing this for Andrew Jones. I started covering Andrew Jones. That was my first major beat out of college. And so that would have been 95. So I've been in some ways involved in the minor leagues for coming up on 30 years. And you get reminded all the time that there are no certainties in this. But Elly De La Cruz is one of those players here, like, he may have flaws, but the problem may be that there does not exist a league high enough. Like if he faced Pedro on Monday at his prime and Maddox on Tuesday and Randy Johnson on Wednesday and Walter Johnson on Thursday, maybe it would be enough to expose these flaws. It may just be that AAA wasn't enough to expose them. And maybe it's that the majors aren't enough to expose them either. That's what I find fascinating with this is every player has a level where if they're not the perfect player, there's something to be exposed. Some of those players that gets exposed in rookie ball, some it gets exposed in low A, some of them it's high A, it's double A, it's triple A. And then every now and then you have those players where it's like, no, there just doesn't exist a level to that can consistently take advantage of their flaws because they're not Ted Williams or not Barry Bonds. They're not the one flawless player that exists at the time.
JJ, I'm going to ask you one more. I'll give Rany a chance to ask one more. You've been very generous with your time. We mentioned Gavin Cross. The consensus was he was supposed to go there. And everybody kind of felt good about that. Then we started digging really deep once he became a Royal. We had done all the surface level stuff when you're looking at, well, it could be any one of these 20 guys. And we dig in and we find out that Gavin Cross played on his father's travel baseball team, and it was a religious-based team, right? Faith was a big part of what they did. Full disclosure, I'm Catholic. My kids go to Catholic school. I'm not anti-religion in any way, shape, or form. But around here, the era of Dayton Moore was very much known. Like you ask somebody, who are they going to draft? They would tell you whoever goes to Bible study most, right? That was a fixture in how the Royals chose players, and that perhaps that was a bigger deal, whether it was the religion aspect or their view of character, what character was, and the makeup was more important than maybe the raw talent. that's the perception amongst many Royals fans. I have heard that there is definitely a message that is changing. So I think that to me is an acknowledgement from within the organization that was an element to it. I've heard some conversations like the goal is not to be the most religious team out there. The goal is to be the best team out there. You're out on the front lines. Is that an accurate portrayal? Was that an important part of the equation? Did that get in the Royals' way at times?
I would say that I don't have enough information to know one way or another. And I would say also, like, this is baseball. And I say this also as a person of faith, but in baseball, if you said, okay, we're only going to if you created a hypothetical draft board and you said, we're going to look at Bible study attendance as part of it, you would still have a large group to choose from. I would say, you would not right away say, well, where did our board go? Again, Gavin Cross to me is an example of a guy. He was taken at the high end of where, but evaluating him as a player, I'm not saying like in any way, like, oh, Gavin Cross, because he's hitting 220 in Quad Cities is done. But, okay. We've known the Midwest League is an example of a league that forever I can remember, again, I've been covering the Royals for a long time. Y'all have too. Like Mike Moustakas, I believe, was hitting 180 there at the end of, May maybe. And then second half was great because it's a lot less miserable to play in the Midwest League come June, July, August. And his June for Gavin Cross has been much better so far. So like, it's one of those things where his struggles have been struggles that fit with what we thought would be potential concerns with Gavin Cross. At the same time, the point that I would also kind of tie in with this is if you redrafted, again, the top 10, 15 picks of last year's draft right now, Gavin Cross is not the one where you go, oh no, what were they thinking? Like, and I'm not trying to pick on Jacob Berry, but Jacob Berry, who went, higher, is hitting 206, 264, 335, and is less athletic and had more position concerns. So we do look back at when you say, well, we think this draft is great. Last year's draft right now is also looking very, very hit or miss right now. And that's the unfortunate thing about, like, when Rany talked about, if the Royals picked really high next year, we look at this in remove and we think of all drafts being somewhat similar, right? Like, we look at it and say, if you bomb on the number 4 pick, that's terrible. And if you hit on the number 8 pick, that's great. And there are years, like, to go back to Royals history, right? There's the year they took Luke Hochevar 1. And you look back on that and you go, why did they take Luke Hochevar 1? But at the same time, I think what you could also say is some years, some years you're like, oh, there's 5 guys who are number 1. Yes, they should have taken Longoria that year in hindsight, but Greg Reynolds and Brad Lincoln went 2 and 4 that year, where you're like, okay, so what you're really saying is and Brandon Morrow, who was fine, went 5. And so you're saying that was a year where of the top 5 picks, one of them ended up being really good. There was, okay, and then the Nationals, what happened for the Nationals? The Nationals picked number 1 right after they changed the rule that meant that you could pick number 1 2 years in a row, not it alternates between AL and NL. And it was the years where, well, one year we have Strasburg and one year we have Harper. And you're like, I said I couldn't run a front office, but I'll tell you this, if I had the number 1 pick and Steven Strasburg's on the board, I can make that pick right. If I had the number 1 pick and Bryce Harper's on the board, I'm not going to screw that one up.
Right.
Terrific. So we always finish with our minor league minute, because no matter how depressing the Royals are, we always try to end up with something positive. So I was wondering if you could just finish this out on something positive. Is there a player in this organization that's maybe off the radar, somebody not a top 10, top 15 prospect, not known by the organization fan base that much, that you've heard, like, good reports about somebody that we should be keeping an eye on that may be up and coming?
So I apologize for
The answer is no.
I do. I mean, what I would say that actually kind of along those lines is, okay, like, I mean, I could take a flyer and say Lisandro Rodriguez or someone like that, right? Like far away, the future is still, but I would also say one of the things that I think that they've actually done a good job of, okay, to end this on a positive note, is, and some of these, like, I've had emails with, for the years now, I think with Michael Massey's father, and he was right. Michael Massey was better than how we ranked him. So I give that, credit on that. I feel like that they've actually done a pretty good job of developing. I remember, I don't talk to this many parents of players, but I remember I was at the Carolina League All-Star game one year, and Nicky Lopez's dad was there, and he's like, "You consistently underranked my son." And it's like, in hindsight, you're right, we did. Like they've done really good. I'll throw like a Michael Garcia in there. I'll throw like maybe a Samad Taylor in there. Like I feel like that they have done a good job of developing that lesser noticed, versatile glove middle infielder. And like I think we just rattled off 5-6 of those, all of whom were not premium picks, all of whom basically have ended up exceeding their expectations. And obviously there have been other players along the way that haven't done so. But that is a profile where I give credit to the Royals. Like there are teams that struggle to develop those type of players. And now the problem is that what the Royals have struggled to produce is, the big middle of the order bats to go with that, right? Like you mentioned, Soren, like Jorge Soler, and I don't know what to do with Jorge Soler right as we're speaking right now. Like Jorge Soler right now, kudos to the Marlins, kudos to Jorge Soler, is, again, he's on the pace to probably have another 40+ home run season. But Jorge Soler, and I'm not going to knock the Royals for not getting much for Jorge Soler, because every time Jorge Soler is traded, I feel like no one gets much for him. The Braves get him, like they're like, we'll throw you some, some pocket change and we get him. And then they turn around and it's like, what do we do with Jorge Soler? Because Jorge Soler, I feel like, is the most hot, cold player in baseball. But at the same time, the Royals haven't developed a whole lot of guys who are like their middle of the order bats in recent years. And they need, even if it's not develop it, the thing that I would say to wrap this in a bow, like we talked about the Rays, and I always bring up the Rays because the Royals have no financial disadvantages when compared to the Rays. There's nothing where you say, well, the Rays can do that, but the Royals can't because they can't spend the money the Rays can, right? And the thing I would say that the Rays do exceptionally well is they are always evaluating their own team as well. For we always talk about their player development, a lot of the players that end up at the big league level for the Rays aren't Rays original players. It's that they are continually saying, this is how we value this player. This is how the industry values them. And if we think that the industry values this player more than we do, then we will be happy to trade them. And if we think if the industry values this player less than we do, we will be happy to acquire him. Mm-hmm. And so they just do this over and over. Junior Caminero is now a top 50 prospect in baseball for us. Junior Caminero was a player that they got because they had a pitcher with good fastball characteristics who they needed to add to the 40-man roster. And they didn't have room to add him. So they're like, okay, can we spin him for a guy who's many, many years away that we won't have to make a 40-man roster decision on anytime soon? They got Junior Caminero. We could do that. I could rattle off, 10 of those examples. That's something where I don't think that I think the Royals are more of we hold and develop our own. And I think sometimes you got to figure out, like, you know what? If the industry thinks this player's better than we think he really is, if we think, to go back a couple of years ago, if we actually think that Vinny Pasquantino is our best first base prospect, and we can spin Nick Prado because other teams think that Nick Prado is our best first base prospect, that might be a good trade. Now, again, having both of them's fine, but that's the kind of thing that I don't think the Royals have been particularly aggressive about doing. And I do think that if you look at the Dodgers, the Rays, teams that are consistently good year in, year out. Like you look at that Rays Tulsa rotation, that Dodgers Tulsa rotation, there's player development as a part of this, but also it is like, hey, can we pick up Kyle Hurt in a deal that no one will notice at the time of the trade? Yes. Can we then make Kyle Hurt into a prospect that could land someone good at the deadline? Yes. You have to be able to do that to grow your own, but also acquire your own as well.
JJ, yeah. I have no idea what you're talking about because we only have this discussion on every single show. So thank you for corroborating what Soren and I have been talking about for the last 2 years.
Yeah, we've said many times, like you've got to look in the mirror and be honest with what looks back at you, and you've got to be able to know your team better than other people do. And they seem to be constantly afraid that they will trade the guy who's going to be the star. And that creates a bit of a paralysis. JJ, you're the man. Great stuff. We really appreciate it. Thanks so much for joining us. Baseball America is the Bible of baseball, and JJ is the editor-in-chief of it. He is a big part of it. I know he will always spread around a lot of love to everybody that's there, but Rany and I both huge fans, and we really appreciate you giving us some time today.
Oh, thank you guys. This was always, I knew it'd be fun, but it was even more fun. And I think I joked, said like, oh, we won't go an hour. Oh yeah, we won't go an hour. So once you get going, it's just too fun to talk about.
We kept quiet. Again, we knew we'd go along. We kept quiet.
Yeah. But you know, with this, like, again, this is something where there are Royals fans listening to this, and I know, like, it's funny, like I don't get to be a fan of any team in particular because of what I do. And I don't say that like, oh, I'm cursed or anything like that. But like, I remember texting with Rany, and reading Rany's stuff in 14, 15. And it's like, and I'm texting with Reds fans that I know now. And it's like, that's as much as it can be frustrating at times. The joy that the fun that comes with when it all comes together, in baseball is one of those special things that it just, it's almost hard to describe.
The beauty of baseball,
it's what makes this fun.
Yeah. The beauty of baseball is that when you're winning, it's every day. The curse of baseball is that when you're struggling, it's every day, right? That is the sword cutting both ways when it comes to that game. That's very well said. And I think Rany and I both know people that are Reds fans or Pirate fans and
Orioles fans. Like, despite the frustration we've had on our local beat this year, this has been a fantastic year for long-suffering fan bases, and I'm rooting for all of those teams.
Yeah, agreed. JJ, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
You're the best. JJ Cooper from Baseball America with us here on the Kaufman Corner. Anything you want to add going out the door, Rany, or do we wrap with that?
I think that we covered it all. I will say I was hoping that he might be a little bit more explicit about things that the Royals are doing differently at the minor league level, and so I was a little bit downtrodden that I didn't hear quite as much evidence of they've definitely made changes. So that was probably the one takeaway that I was not hoping to get. But if anybody knows what's going on at the minor league level, it's JJ.
It's absolutely
you got a lot of great information there.
All right. Remember, we're brought to you by GAN Asphalt and Concrete, proudly serving the greater KC area. If you've got parking lot problems, GAN's been making them disappear since 1994. Full service paving and pavement maintenance contractor. Free consultations, no commissions. Every project comes with a written warranty. You can find them online right now at ganasphalt.com or call 816-484-3338. Make sure you tell them you heard about them here on the Kaufman Corner podcast. When we come to you next, we'll be talking about the draft. We'll be a couple of rounds into it. Looking forward to that. So for the good doctor, Dr. Rany Jazayerli, my name is Soren Petro, saying thank you very much for joining us